RI Unit Podcast Episode 4.
Insights by Professor Radhika Desai, The Current State of the Struggle Between the US and China, Part 2.
The United States had begun making nice with China, as everybody knows, going back to the 1970s, initially in order to drive a wedge between between China and the Soviet Union, deepening the Sino-Soviet split, etc. But by the time the 1980s came around, with China launched on its path of reform and opening up, the United States saw this as an opportunity to acquire what was essentially a vast colony of industrious, productive people who could be relied upon to supply the United States with cheap manufactured goods, be essentially an outlet for the United States' own high-value capital exports, as well as capital itself, whether in the form of FDI or other means. So it imagined that it was essentially acquiring this sort of vast as I say, colony that could be relied on to remain in neoliberal subordination to itself. But by the time the new century opened, it was already becoming clear that China had no intention of accepting this subordinate position. China had every intention of using every opportunity available to it, whether it took the form of US FDI or any other country's FDI, or access to markets, which of course expanded vastly with the accession of China into the World Trade Organization in the year 2000, and so on. Every opportunity, the ability to send students to study abroad, everything, to essentially contribute to not only the industrialization of China, but also an industrialization that was committed to making its way up the value chain. And this, the party state began to execute already in the certainly by the new century. This was obvious in the 1990s. People could still talk about China as an exporter of cheap, even shoddy goods, toys, and so on. But now China had to be taken seriously. So throughout the 21st century, we first had Bush Jr.'s steel and aluminium tariffs. Under Obama, you got the so-called pivot to Asia, because the awareness of a threat coming from China to the US industrial base. Remember, throughout all this, the US is deindustrializing. And of course, by 2008, the US had this financial crisis, which, by the way, I would say was not the global financial crisis, as everybody seems to call it. It was a very North Atlantic financial crisis, and we'll come back to that later. But anyway, so the United States was continuing to get weaker, China was continuing to get stronger, and China's ability to turn its economy around on a dime in 2008 became very clear. They unleashed this massive investment boom, and then 2 or 3 years later, when that was exhausted in terms of what it could do to continue Chinese growth, then they have since been allowing wages to grow, and there have been all sorts of other changes to the economic strategy. But China has continued industrializing. Today, it is the producer of ever more sophisticated goods, as we see, whether we look at the chip situation or the EV situation, etc. So what we've seen is China has continued to industrialize, and that is why the United States sees China as a challenge. And that is why the United States is trying to block China's industrialization. Unfortunately, it's not going to work. Just as the US's ability to dominate the world economy did not work, simply because the world economy has become way too multipolar already by the time the US had the chance to even attempt to do this in the 20th century. But now China in particular, being a socialist economy, has essentially demonstrated that it can and very likely will overtake the United States, not just in terms of the quantity of production, in terms of GDP, but also in qualitative terms as essentially the pace setter.